So, with everything going on in the world right now, here we are sitting with our bookcases and our desks in our quiet spaces and recording video in our spare rooms and our cars. And we're here talking about things like life purpose and authenticity and what should we do with our lives. Meanwhile, we're watching reels of 10-year-olds in war-torn areas generating electricity from junk parts that they found scattered around so that they can bring electricity into their family's tent. I don't think that it's likely that they're framing what they're doing in terms of, is this authentic for me? Is this part of my life purpose? It's just, in that situation, it obviously is. But for us, what I think these types of juxtapositions show us is rather something more about the question. It's about the question, what should I do with my life? That's symptomatic. Or we might also ask, how can I make a living without abandoning myself, without abandoning what makes my life worth living? So we're sitting here able to ask that question, and I think that there are things in that question itself which are quite symptomatic of the situation that we're thrown into. So in my last video on what gives meaning to life, I argued that meaning is already intrinsic to consciousness, and life, when it's being lived well, is a form of consciousness, a form of living consciousness. And that's the level of life that we deep down, we already know that we want to live from. And it's the level in which we're already in touch with meaning because we're living from consciousness, which has meaning intrinsic to it. It's maybe even the medium of consciousness as we experience it in this human incarnation. So the opposite of this, for example, is when we feel like we're just going through the motions. And that's why the experience of going through the motions completely sucks if you've been there, because it literally does feel like we've been drained, we feel empty, we have lost our clarity, we no longer feel our sense of drive. And what's happened is we literally have cut ourselves off from the flow of our own consciousness, which is always present in the background. And it's just, are we in relation to it? Are we open to that? Have we cut off our own flow, so to speak? And so when we ask things like, what is my life purpose? In the very concept, it's really, it works like as a conceptual shorthand. It's like an abbreviation for a whole bunch of related questions. So let's just take a minute here and let's go back, because when you're really young, people ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's really abstract because you're not yet in touch with the sense of who you are on a conceptual level. So a child knows what they like. They may be very in touch with their gifts and fluent in their gifts and expressing their gifts. But precisely because the brain is still in development, there isn't really that mature conception of self that we can later on articulate and pose very specific questions about in terms of values, and am I meeting my standards, and am I acting on an authentic basis? And so that's to be expected. It's the same thing with the way children don't yet have a very distinct, detailed conception of the world. You need, like, these concepts, self and world, will evolve at the same time through the type of friction that you get through moving through life. And then, so later on, like in our teens or early 20s, like the exact time is a bit different for everyone. You'll feel this question more like, what do I want to do with my life now that I am presented with this expanse, now that I no longer have this immediate structure of schooling? And this is for a lot of people, maybe a majority of people. I know there's all kinds of situations that may not exactly correspond to this, but for most of us watching here today, it's likely some version of this. And if you're highly gifted on top of that, it's not just like an obvious answer to this question, like you doing what you're good at. Like if you're good at 7 things and you're passionate about 5 things and they're all promising, and what do you develop? And the question of should extends even to like, what type of logic should I even be using to make this decision? So I've talked about that in some of my earlier videos too, on gifted empaths specifically, and why that's such a challenge for us. And so what we end up doing, most of us, is we end up making really rational decisions at that point. So it's actually pretty rare, I think, to be in a family where your caregivers or your parents are actually like very supportive of just saying, follow your heart, follow your intuition right now. Most people don't really know about following their intuition on such a deep level anyway. So I think that's already pretty rare. Like, let me know what your experience was. And then there's also the fact, let's just face it, that at that age, late teens, early 20s, there still isn't yet enough mental structure to really like prevent you from falling down some potentially dangerous rabbit holes. So we're right to be concerned in some sense at that juncture. Rabbit holes of different kinds, like maybe just like super partying, super like different ideologies. And it's all very innocent and it's quite predictable. Like we do need to go through some sort of stage like that. We know at a fundamental level that we need to move through these periods of discovery and exploration and wandering. And at that juncture, it often takes the form of a so-called gap year, right? I think I probably took effectively like two of them, and that was even after doing like 2 more years at a technical school. So we know we need these periods of exploring and enjoying without being imposed upon by artificial external structures. And if we don't get some of that on an authentically cyclical basis, it does lead to mental health problems and even potentially physical problems. So there's going to be more aggression, less sensitivity, more rigidity, more avoidance, less compassion. And so what often happens at that age is we basically end up getting into various types of compromises, right? We know that we don't know ourselves well enough yet because we need more of these kinds of adventures, but we also know that we're supposed to get with the program. And because that type of structured approach, for example, starting a career or developing your own financial foundation, we know we need to do that. It's important. So we probably kind of make some kind of muddy decision in here. We do something like, well, I have really good grades in science, and it is definitely probably smart to take the path towards, becoming a doctor. And we already know that's socially sanctioned, so it must be good, right? It must be right, right? And then in the first or second year of college, you get buried with overwhelm, or that's when your parent dies, or that's when you realize something about who you're really attracted to. And, your grades begin to drop, and then you start to kind of downgrade your plan mentally, and you tell yourself, well, I can still go into nursing. And this works until the next crisis because we're still not yet close to the core of examining like who we are. Now, what brings us to that core? Well, or how do we recognize that core? It's really the edge of what I would call like our own existential black hole. Um, it's when we reach the place of being fully conscious of the trade-off that we're making with time being the medium of our consciousness. So this can happen when the effort that we're putting into our 3D plan, the plan that our social self came up with, which it all very well may have been very authentic to us at the time, the effort begins to feel incredibly expensive. Like you begin to you are consciously aware of the trade-off you are making, even like moment to moment. And you might run into like very persistent questions like, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing with my life? Or how can this be my life right now? Or we might even start to make lists on the side of like what we will really do, like when this is all over, right? When we get through this. And like my own mental existential crisis really started to get vocal as I began studying for my doctoral exams. It was just like the pressure and intensity of it, and the intensity of like the consequences and what it all meant. And it just kind of really pushed me off the edge in the sense of like I could no longer keep a core dissociation at bay. Not my own authentic dissociation, but that dissociation from like the contradiction of um yeah, like the social self and the program that you know you need to follow. So this is where it gets really complicated, right? Because there's different levels or contexts of where our authenticity is operating. So for me at that point, it was kind of as if my higher self just really stepped in and kind of like dragged this issue out front and center so that I wouldn't miss it. And then I kind of just fell into like my own proverbial black hole of pure awareness, where it's like the social self begins to get stretched out, just like you see in those images of what happens to space time on the edge of a black hole. That's why I think this is such a great metaphor. So it's as if you make a shift from identifying with the space time perspective, you know, the perspective of like your social self, your resume, everything you had to be to maintain that. And then you make this kind of flip of the switch to what is really a loss of identification actually, but now you're on the side of pure awareness, or pure presence instead, basically. So to go back to this question of life path or life purpose, the way we usually think about this is a very 3D oriented question. It's framed within this 3D type of matrix. And so we need to, when we usually ask that, we're trying to figure out how to fit ourselves into the economic system. And that's really like the Heideggerian situation that we've been thrown into, right? We all know this. We know at a deep level, even before we know it like intellectually, we know that we're trading our consciousness for money. And that is, even if we don't put it in those words, we know that it's wrong. Like we know that the trade-off is not equal. So let's bracket out all these conversations about, oh, money is evil and everything. That's not where I'm trying to go with this. Let's just bracket that to the side. All I'm saying here is that what consciousness wants to do is communicate with itself. Consciousness wants to produce meaning and to discover meaning by moving through different perspectives and vantage points, which we get from having different experiences and talking to different people and cultures. And there's a very natural process of awakening that wants to come through. So again, it's not that like money is evil. I'm not trying to go there. It's in the same way that like time itself is not evil. It's just that these are 3D concepts. And time, of course, is even more than just a 3D concept. It's just that it's really been appropriated into that perspective, like hardwired for us. And both of these are just really at odds with what consciousness wants and how consciousness wants to develop. So again, a little disclaimer, as I've said elsewhere, consciousness is something much more than our phenomenal perception. It's not perceptual awareness, okay? That's what perception means. Consciousness goes far beyond our 3D dimension, our 3D world. It goes as deep as source, basically. It's fundamental. And everything below that, so to speak, or several degrees removed from that, is a further reduction or filtration of consciousness. So that by the time you get down here into the 3D level, look at what we're doing collectively. Like we're literally addicted to automation, which is literally the obliteration of consciousness. It's saying we want to create a process where we do not need consciousness because consciousness is going to create friction, right? We want something smooth, mechanical, automated. That's all that AI is really. It's the automation of higher processes, cognition, intelligence. That's what I was getting into in my last video. And so even taking it further now, you can go into 2 dimensions where now all you have are representations of consciousness. So like little watermarks or like concentrated consciousness powder. And that's what you get in artworks, really. These are traces of consciousness. And when we want to like go take a trip to the museum or something. That's what we're really doing. It's like we're going to take, give me some little supplement of like consciousness, and maybe I can reanimate this for myself. And in many cases that works, right? Like some of these artworks are extremely potent, and if you're tuned in on that level, this is where I trained, you can definitely, there's something happening there. You can like really tune back into the consciousness out of that time. This is what people spoke about with the aura and so on, but I'm digressing. What we really need, what we were doing when we want to answer this question of life purpose, what should I do? What should I be doing with my life? Here's what I would say is to try to shift this into the perspective of what does my consciousness need most now or next? And it's often going to be in the direction of something that is required for your healing. And here's where we get into the topic of integration, right? Because consciousness wants to integrate. That is literally the development of consciousness, the development of your own relationship with meaning as you are able to experience it in this lifetime. So we need integration. And so, for example, instead of like working administration at a forestry company, maybe you really have this calling to like work directly with trees. Like that's really, it's not that that's what you're supposed to be doing for the rest of your life, but that's your next authentic step. You're being called. It's not intellectual. You're not rationalizing it. You just like feel this deep like longing or being drawn to that. And somehow you don't know what shape that's going to look like, but you just know like, you know what, I just want to work more directly with whatever, conservation or planting trees. And then maybe even that itself changes in a few years, but the point is that that is a necessary like transitional place for you. It's an authentic step which develops the foundation for what might become your real work afterwards. So what I'm trying to drive at here is that there are levels of awareness to this question of life purpose or life path. And if you're watching this, I think it's 99% likely that you're already beyond like the base level of the survival status quo, where, you know, you're just going to take like whatever is the first job that comes along that can give you the money so that you can just continue kind of your own basic survival status quo that got you to this point. More likely is, you know, you're not interested in like staying in the same small town, working at the same factory that employs everybody else, so everybody can go to the same bar every weekend. Not judging any one of those things individually, but I'm just pointing out like the cycle that that can perpetuate, because it's not, that's not conducive to consciousness. Like in individual cases, it might be the case that that's like where you're supposed to be at that time. But on some, it's more symptomatic than it is like a place for cultivating consciousness in the way that you likely need to. So you know that you're here to like work out an authentic solution to this very modern problem of trading consciousness for money. And an authentic solution, for example, this is my own understanding here. We could finesse this a little bit more, but I think that it would be, it's one where you're not really compromising on like core values or core integrity, and where you also perceive that it's at least still a fair exchange. So if you're going to lose the ability to be the author of your own time consciousness, which is what's happening, whether you're at like a 9 to 5 job or you're on a 12-hour shift at the hospital, whatever you trade this for, you're literally trading your stream of consciousness, because even though it's always on in the background, it's just massively like, it's like closing the aperture down and putting all these other conditions and stresses on your body. It's really extracting or severing your body from your own intuitive signals. Whatever you're trading all that for needs to be solving more than just the problem of money, which it actually creates or represents that problem itself. Do you see what I mean? And then finally, there's a level above this as well, which is where many of you are also probably at, and that is constructing a truly aligned position or role for yourself. So again, this is my own understanding that I'm developing, but alignment, I would say, goes a step beyond authenticity here, because now we're not just responding to whatever situation we've been thrown into in accordance with our own values and understanding and our own sense of our own integrity. That's very authentic, it's necessary. But we are now trying to create from a deeper level of from where our consciousness is actually at, and from information that we are bringing in from, you can call it our higher self, or from just our own understanding of our higher purpose, our higher sense of our our core values, our highest values. And the skill and work here is to develop this in such a way that it supports our growth without draining our energy, and without like downgrading or denying like the fullness of our awareness and our experience. And when we do that, when we can get on that level, then we can actually serve others in a similar way, and it's not going to take away from our own energy. It can amplify it. Actually, it's the amplification of consciousness. So ideally, like, we want to be living at the edge of our awakening. Like, that's where we want to be. That's what actually feels good. That's actually what should feel natural. And this place of awakening, of course, it's a stream that's always unfolding, right? We will naturally bring in new truths for ourselves, like new directions for our own development. But the further that we are from that process, the more that we cut ourselves off from this flow, and for a longer period of time, like, the worse we are going to feel. And this is why we have, so many like medical intuitives who can talk about the spiritual roots of physical disease. This is where the connection comes from. So we get back to that though by taking our next authentic steps. So if that's the kind of like stuck place that you're in right now, like if you're stuck between sets of decisions, you want to go to like the next authentic step. So you may have a very concrete problem to solve first, and that's completely authentic. So from there though, we learn to, this is where we actually evolve, by learning how to shift ourselves into the aligned state, like our aligned version, where we can actually respond and receive our own higher guidance and contribute to the world from that place. Again, our highest self, if you want to think about it differently, it's just our own sense of our highest purpose, like the best version of who we can be based on what we want to contribute, our own sense of the best of who we are, like our highest values. You get my point. And again, so we're going beyond the level of the 3D economy, which is, it's very real, it's very heavy, it's very dense, it's based on so many legacies from the past, a lot of like violence and aggression, and we know all these ways we can do better, right? And so this is one of the ways out. So let me know if this has made sense to you, like if you recognize yourself in some part of this process. And if you want, feel free to share like any specific like blocks or issues you're having, like places where you feel stuck within decisions along this path. And yeah, I really look forward to hear about that and to talk with you further about that. So as usual, I will see you in the comments, and we'll continue talking.